Hi everyone! So the next major item on my list for the Paving Your Own Path series was ritual, building ritual, structuring it and that kind of thing. And this is kind of one of the last major things that I want to talk about in this series. The other major thing being daily practice. And then beyond that I'll probably be making other videos on more specific topics as well. But building ritual is obviously one of the biggest tasks that you're going to face when you are creating your own spiritual practice. Now, people from other traditions, like people who are coming to a solitary practice from Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism or anything like that, there isn't so much of a tradition of actually doing ritual. There might be more of a tradition of, say, saying a rosary, doing meditation. Generally sitting in sacred space will be quite common in those kind of other major religious traditions. But it's really in paganism and earth-based spirituality that this kind of tradition of doing ritual, of building your own kind of ceremony has really arisen. And basically the reason for that is because that the beginnings of the pagan movement arose out of kind of ceremonial magic, Western kind of ceremonial Christian-based magic. There's also, of course, influences from the Kabbalah and stuff like that. But there has been this strong connection from its inception between paganism and various forms of paganism and magical practice. And of course ceremonial practice is all based around ritual and ceremony and having very specific actions that you kind of have to go through in order to connect in the right way and bring all the right elements together. And that has very much kind of stayed in place when it comes to people who are branching out of more kind of strict ceremonial practices like traditional Wicca and things like that into more eclectic stuff. The idea of casting a circle is something that a lot of people hold on to. Now, a lot of the time the casting of the circle will look nothing like maybe the original kind of ceremonial casting of the circle that would have been probably developed in medieval times, I think. But sorry, I'm a bit distracted. It just started lashing rain outside. But it is kind of worth bearing in mind that it's fairly unusual, this idea of an individual working through this very complicated ritual. And in many ways it means that the pagan or the earth-based practitioner or the goddess-based practitioner, solitary practitioner, is their own priest or their own shaman. And it's quite an unusual role to be playing because most of the time traditionally in religion it's quite a communal thing. There is kind of a community involved and you go to the big ceremonies as a community in a big social gathering, and there will be a priest or some sort of religious figure of authority, a shaman or some sort of figure who is generally understood to be connected to and tapped into the divine in some way, that they know the mysteries and they will kind of conduct the ritual. So it is quite unusual for an individual to be in a position of having to do that themselves, as opposed to sort of having that communal religion and then maybe having some components of individual practice at home. But generally speaking, the focus would be on the communal aspect. So I think it's good to remember from the outset that what you're doing it's really quite tricky. It's not, if you feel like your rituals are falling short, that you're not quite managing to achieve the wonderful altered states of consciousness that you're hoping you will, or the wonderful feeling of connection and awe and everything, don't feel bad about that and don't beat yourself up about that, because it's quite a tricky task, and it requires something slightly different as well than building ritual for an audience, because if you're building it for an audience or a group of people, it's obviously going to require very, very different kind of actions as well. And I will say that as well, that when it comes to things like circle casting and a lot of rituals, like outlined rituals that you will find, sometimes they are actually better suited to group ritual than individual practice, and sometimes the things that fall flat in solitary practice fall flat because they're not really best suited to a solitary practitioner. So those things are just worth bearing in mind. And I think it's a great and really exciting prospect to think of yourself as being your own shaman. That this is the process of developing ritual, whether you do that beforehand, and whether you build a really strict and stringent practice that you kind of repeat over and over again and again, or whether you do it totally spontaneously in the moment, and I will talk about that in a minute. Whichever way you choose to do it, you are entering into this very specific kind of journey. And it is a process of trying to unravel the unconscious and unravel that connection between the conscious and the unconscious, and figuring out which symbols, and I did talk about symbolism in a previous video, which symbols are the most evocative for you, and how you can express those symbols, and how you can tie them together, and how you can sort of do what needs to be done in the ritual space. It is quite complex. It will never be the same twice in a row. And sometimes you really just have to let go of the wonderful magical ideas you have in your head about what a ritual will be and feel like, and just accept that sometimes they will fall flat. Sometimes you just won't achieve what you were hoping to achieve, and that's okay, because you can go back to it again. And if you didn't manage to achieve what you thought you wanted to, then maybe you'll find a different way soon to go back and do that again, or whatever it is. So from the very beginning, the first thing that you want to think about when you're developing a ritual, and now I'm talking about either ritual in general, a sort of ritual that you will go back to again and again throughout the year, or a specific ritual for a specific Sabbath or Esbat, or just for a specific purpose. The first thing you want to think about is purpose. Is why are you doing ritual in the first place? What is your aim? What's your goal? What are you trying to achieve? And you might find that while you think that you know this, because ritual is just the center of your spirituality, your spiritual practice, and the reasons for doing ritual are perhaps the same as the reasons you have for being spiritual in the first place. But it's actually really good to get really concrete and clear about this, because it will be more specific than just the general, your general spirituality. You are spiritual and spiritually centered for one reason, but your reasons for doing ritual should be slightly more specific than that, because you're taking action. You can be spiritual without doing ritual at all, and really without doing very much kind of dedicated practice at all, because you can be spiritual just in your mind, in your daily life as you go about. You can be thinking spiritually, thinking about the divine, and thinking about the connectivity of everything and all that kind of thing. So the decision to do ritual is something that you should take seriously and think about, why am I doing this? And don't take it for granted that you're going to do ritual either. There's nothing wrong with having a spiritual practice where you just pray or meditate, or, like I say, just live your spirituality day to day by, having tiny little prayers that you say when you do certain things, or just ways that you think that while you're doing a certain thing, that you're thinking about what that means on a larger scale and that kind of thing. So really be clear on why you're doing ritual and why you want to do ritual and where you're hoping to go. Because I think that the best ritual will happen if there is somewhere you want to go. And you might not know where that is, as long as you're aware that you want to go somewhere. You want to change, you want some change, some movement to happen. And like I say, this goes for ritual in general, and then also when it comes to developing or outlining a ritual for a specific day or a specific purpose. And yeah, I won't get in too much into purpose, because that is going to be different for every individual person. But it will vary very much depending on whether your spirituality is, as I touched on before, based more on self-development or more on devotion. And if it's based more on devotion, then your purpose for ritual might be revering the gods or revering goddess, or just very kind of devotionally centered. Whereas if it's self-development that you're more focused on, then it might be to do with going within, exploring the psyche, achieving some sort of inner change, releasing things, allowing things to come in. So you will find yourself having probably a preference for one over the other, or you might find that you have both, and that you want to achieve both. And you might want to think about whether you can do that through the same ritual actions. Like, is your devotion of Kali, for example, just part of and completely intertwined with your desire to achieve, to maybe release the ego and achieve connection and feel connected to the cycles of cosmos, for example. Or you might find that they're two different components, that they are quite separate, that you want to acknowledge divinity, that you want to work with deities or what have you, but then also you want to, go within and do this certain kind of psychological work with yourself, almost like self-counseling. And they might be two different things, and you might need to think about that when you're developing your ritual or when you're planning your ritual. You might need to think about whether those two parts need to stand separate or how they're going to interact. And sometimes you might start out thinking that they're different, and as you go along you realise that they're mirroring each other, and that's very true for me. I do sort of think of the devotional aspects of my practice as being different to the self-developmental ones, but they completely mirror each other, and they're totally intertwined. So it's not as easy as just saying, right, this is the part where I'm expressing my devotion, this is the part where I'm doing my inner work. It will just be, it's all about going within, going without, and at the end of the day it'll all be quite mixed in together. But it's good to get clear at the outset. So then the second thing that you want to do when it comes to kind of building your practice is to start thinking about your symbolism that you've outlined before, the religious symbolism that is really kind of potent for you, and start thinking about how you can actually express that in ritual. And it's great to do that kind of in practical, physical, tangible form. It's great to have images or things on your altar maybe, and things representative of those symbols. But I also think it's equally important to try to work in actions that represent those symbols too. So actions can include lighting incense, pouring a substance like pouring water, pouring tea, drinking something like water or tea or wine, pouring libations. Maybe you want to water a plant as part of your ritual. I mean, the list goes on. You can create art. You can develop hand movements. Hand movements are wonderful, and you can feel quite different whether you have your hands kind of outstretched or across your body or raised up. You might want to develop different hand movements for each of your main symbols as well, so that when you're kind of trying to tap into a certain symbol or a certain concept, that you can use those hand movements to kind of to really reinforce that psychological association. And over time you will find that as soon, if you have a certain hand movement, a way that you raise your hands when you're talking to, say, your matron goddess, you will find that every time you do that with your hands, you instantly start to feel that connection. So it's really good to have multiple connections and to be using as many senses as possible. You might want to consider using music and stuff like that. Again, you might want to have a certain song or a certain tune or melody for specific symbols. That's a really potent one for me. And while I used to have kind of a playlist playing in the background initially, these days what I do is I sing. And I've picked up various little chants and even little bits of songs. Like I have a song from the soundtrack of Lord of the Rings that I like to sing, just because I love Lord of the Rings, and why not? So I've picked up, like a magpie, I've picked up various little bits. I've written one or two myself that I just sort of spontaneously sang in the moment and then memorised. That can be wonderful too if you're a musical person or just hourly inclined. But of course words can be just as powerful if you're not musical, if you can't stand your own singing voice, or if you're just not interested in having music playing in the background. You also of course have the words that you're speaking, and those are obviously an incredibly important part of the ritual. But what I want to make clear here is that you don't just want to have your altar sitting there with your symbols all neatly lined up and then your ritual script here, and you're reading out your ritual script and the stuff is there and this is here and there's just no connection going on whatsoever. The more you can memorize, the better. If you're reading out something long, you might need to have written notes, but do that as little as possible, I would say, because the unconscious mind doesn't respond particularly well to a script or reading something. Like I say, there is definitely space for that in the ritual setting, and I definitely do that. Like if it's a long poem or something that you've written that is quite lengthy, that you're like reasonably not going to memorize, then I see absolutely no problem with doing that. But I think for the most part, either say it spontaneously in the moment from the heart, or make sure that the little bits and pieces that you want to say are memorized. And basically what I'm trying to say is that you want to start making connections between the symbols on the altar and the words you're speaking and the actions you're doing, so that it all kind of starts to come together in a coherent whole, and it starts to feel all like one kind of organic expression of your core beliefs and those core symbols. And the more that you can kind of intertwine the different senses, you know, what you can see, the movement, what you can feel, what you can smell, if there's incense, particular incense that you want to burn, and what you can hear, the words that you're speaking, the more that you can associate all of those things together, the better. One great way that I have of doing that is that while I do have like the statues and different things on the altar, I also have candles that represent certain things. That's a really common thing in pagan ritual, and it works really well because you have the visual association, especially if you have a part of your altar that's associated with a certain symbol. When you're evoking that symbol, you can light that candle and you're very much feeling as though, yes, or this is what I'm focusing on right now. These are the words that are associated. This is the song that's associated. This is the hand movement or the gesture. And then maybe you want to pour a libation or make an offering or whatever it is. And offerings can just be something that you place in something on the altar or whatever as well. So then I think it's obviously what it kind of leads into that, and maybe I should have talked about this first, but then it's important to really think about in ritual who you're talking to and who you're addressing or what you're addressing. Because I've talked a little bit there about like words and what you're going to say in ritual and stuff like that, and the symbols and stuff like that. But it's all very well kind of having these symbols and saying these words and doing this singing and stuff. But if you're not clear, and obviously you have your purpose, you know, you're just like, are you devoting it to something? Are you trying to connect to deity? Are you trying to change something within yourself? But I think when it comes to actually speaking the words that you speak in ritual, and most of the time you will be saying something, kind of praying, saying some sort of prayer, some sort of mantra, whatever it is. If you're not really clear on who you're addressing this to, that's also a recipe for things falling flat as well, because you might feel as though you're just sort of parading around and you're not really sure why. And if your belief system tells you that you're not actually talking, nobody's listening apart from yourself, that's absolutely fine. But you might want to get on board with thinking about maybe even personifying your unconscious. Because if you think you're talking to yourself, well then you're talking to the parts of your psyche that you don't have access to ordinarily, right? Because that's generally the whole idea when it comes to spiritual practice or self-development, is that, you know, you're trying to tap into parts of your mind or parts of your psyche that are not sort of part of the mundane. And you might want to personify that, and a wonderful way of personifying those parts of yourself, if that is your belief system, is to use gods. Now, obviously you might believe that gods are separate entities, but if you don't, there's nothing inauthentic or disingenuous about working with gods while understanding them to simply be archetypes or parts of your psyche. And how you understand that to work will vary hugely. Like, I hear all sorts of different interpretations of what the archetypes really are and how they work and that kind of thing. But that will help too. If you say to yourself, I'm addressing this to Athena, for example, but you don't really believe in Athena. Athena is a symbol for you. Get very clear on whether Athena is a symbol of something out there or something in here or both. And whatever it is, that's fine. But I think to some extent, if you have fairly naturalistic beliefs that you don't really believe in gods that are actually listening to you, or in some way being connected to, being kind of contacted by your actions, I think it is important, even if you think that the gods are symbols of outer energies and forces or things in the universe, I think it's also important to acknowledge that they are also within, and that you are to some degree addressing this to the Athena or whoever within, because at the end of the day, the only person listening, if that is your belief, is you, and you're going to feel a little bit strange if you feel like you're addressing all of this to the world and the world isn't listening. But you're listening, and that's important. I really believe that that's very important, and that acknowledging that and getting on board with that can really, really make a big change in how in just lessening the amount of disingenuity. Is that actually a word? You know what I mean? And just sometimes feeling a little bit like you're just putting on a bit of a show, and that you're not being totally authentic. But yeah, if you're honest with yourself about who you think is listening and why you're doing it, that's really, really important, and that'll really stand to you. And if that means that you don't want to speak at all in ritual, then fine, don't speak. But like I say, I don't think there's any harm in acknowledging that nobody else can hear you but you, but every part of you, your whole psyche is listening, and that's powerful stuff. It really is. But of course, if you believe in personified deity, then that won't be an issue at all, probably. But also think about, if you do believe in personified deity, think about how you think that this is actually getting through to them. If you think that they're paying attention in some way to what you do, or that what you are doing or saying is literally connecting you to some sort of spiritual being or spiritual force or whatever, do think about how you think that works, and don't let yourself just sort of get into sort of that you're just kind of plodding along doing what you do and not thinking too much about the process of what's actually going on. That's important too, for really just injecting some reverence into the proceedings and making it feel kind of more real and more profound. And yeah, and then finally, another thought on the symbolism and stuff that you integrate into your ritual. When it comes to actually formulating the structure of the ritual itself, like what actions you're going to take, and how you're going to create sacred space. Are you going to create sacred space? Are you going to cast a circle? What's the order in which you're going to acknowledge certain things? It's a good idea to think about your belief system, and in fact maybe your creation myth, if you have such a thing. And this is something I was talking to a client about recently. She was talking about feeling the need to write her own creation myth, because that's an important thing to her, the history of the universe. And that can be really potent as well. And to some extent, I think this is always present in ritual, and this is something that I always did as well, that I would kind of build my ritual structure, that I would write my ritual basically starting from the Big Bang, so the symbolism of sort of the all and existence, and very kind of tenuous and overarching things like that. And then that I would kind of get as far as kind of galaxies forming and the earth forming, so then I would address the earth and maybe the directions, cardinal directions, or whatever I wanted to do, the elements. Then I would kind of get as far as life, and then humans. So then once we get into humans, we're looking at maybe a god and goddess or archetypes or anything like that. And I kind of went along like that. Now, it's been a while since I did it that way, but I do still cover certain areas, I do still kind of move from the most basic part, or the beginning, I suppose. I do move from the beginning, from where I understand the universe to begin and what I believe to be the most basic component of it, outwards to, and I end with personified deity, which I understand to be kind of reflections of the human psyche that are reflections of cosmos, but it's quite micro. So from the macro to the micro. And that's definitely a wonderful way to start thinking about how to structure your ritual, because if you're not interested in casting a circle the traditional way, or even if you are, you might want to think about what kind of path you're walking along as you go further and further and deeper into ritual. And you do kind of want to end up at a point, you want to be getting somewhere in ritual, I think. You kind of want to be moving somewhere. You want to have a destination. And you might actually want to do it the opposite way around. You might want to start with yourself and then move outwards to kind of your psyche that you aren't, you're unconscious, and then move outwards to community and to the earth, and outwards and outwards and outwards to all of cosmos. And that could be where you find the center of your ritual, is at that point of connection with everything. That can be a really potent way to do it as well. But whatever your belief system is, and it doesn't have to be linear either, it can just be like a system of things of cycles that happen in the universe, like creation and destruction and stuff like that. Whatever kind of story that you have about cosmos will generally be a really potent way to start kind of structuring your ritual and figuring out what needs to be addressed, what needs to be acknowledged, and what order you want to do that in. And there's just infinite amount of ways that you can do that, because there are just an infinite amount of symbols that you can choose and work with and experiment with to express certain things. And also what you think are the central components or the central spokes of the eternally moving spiral of the universe is, you know, that's going to change too. Different symbols, different concepts will come and go for you, and you will definitely want to keep experimenting with that. So I know different people will have different ways of, you know, some people will want to stick with the same ritual structure for their whole lives, and some people will want to completely change it up from month to month, and that's something that you will just learn as you go along, really. And definitely don't feel too hemmed in. Like, for a long time during my first year of my really like dedicated spiritual practice, where I was celebrating every Sabbath and very much being very spiritually centered for the first time in my life, I felt as though I was trying to perfect a ritual structure, and that eventually I was going to get to the perfect expression of my beliefs and my understanding of the universe and the universe story and everything. And I realized after a year that it was changing just as much every time. It was still constantly in flux, and it wasn't so much that I wasn't managing to properly encapsulate what I felt or what I wanted to experience in ritual. It was also just that I was changing too, that my ideas about things were changing, what I wanted to acknowledge in ritual was changing. And that's really important to remember too. So you might have a couple of things that you will always stick with, and I do still have a few components of my ritual that I think are there to stay. And the names that I use have changed, and the words that I use change all the time, but you know, some aspects will always stay. And for me, the kind of binary of creation destruction is probably there to stay, and the triple acknowledgement of kind of cosmos kind of as existence, and then creation and destruction, that seems to be the core of my belief system and the core of my ritual, and that is, you know, that's something I will always acknowledge. But everything else changes, and everything else I think should be open to change if you feel like it's necessary. So I hope that was helpful, and all the best with your ritual writing endeavours.